The year was 1998. At an altitude of 15,000 feet on Mount Tupungato, two Argentine mountaineers were climbing the mountain. During their climb, they came across a piece of metal. Normally, there is nothing in such places except snow. You rarely see any people there. So finding a piece of metal in such a remote location was shocking in itself. Right next to it, they found a huge metal structure with the words Rolls-Royce written on it. It turned out to be an aircraft engine. They also found pieces of clothing nearby. But the question was, how did these metal fragments and an aircraft engine end up at such a high altitude? When investigators looked into it, they discovered that everything was connected to an incident that had happened almost 50 years earlier. So, let's uncover the mysterious story buried beneath the snow in today's video. It was August 2nd, 1947 at Morón Airport in Argentina. A British South American Airways BSAA aircraft was preparing for takeoff. It was an Avro Lancastrian model 691, better known as Stardust. The aircraft was scheduled to fly to Santiago, Chile. 5 crew members and 6 passengers boarded the aircraft. The flight was to be commanded by Captain Cook, a highly experienced pilot. He had previously flown aircraft in the Air Force and had even served during World War II. The first officer was Norman, and the aircraft's radio operator was D. Hammer. The Stardust aircraft had also been used during World War II. In fact, it had originally been built for military operations, including firing weapons and dropping bombs. With a total of 11 people on board, the aircraft took off at 1:46 p.m. After takeoff, everything was going smoothly. Gradually, the aircraft climbed to an altitude of 8,000 feet. During the journey, the crew had to cross the Andes Mountains. To do that, they needed to climb to an altitude of around 20,000 to 25,000 feet. After crossing the mountains, they would descend to about 10,000 feet, and from there, they would continue to their destination, Santiago. Back then, there were no advanced communication systems or modern GPS tracking. Although radio communication had already been introduced, it was still a brand new technology. Its range was extremely limited. Once an aircraft took off and entered a remote area, maintaining radio contact became almost impossible. I couldn't find any reliable information confirming whether Stardust was equipped with radio communication, so for the sake of this story, let's assume that it wasn't. Even if it had been, it wouldn't have made much difference because in a remote region like the Andes, communicating over the radio was practically impossible anyway. That is why the most effective method of communication at the time was Morse code. To explain Morse code in a simple way, I'd like you to imagine an old ringtone. Morse code is simply a combination of short and long beeps. One short beep and one long beep. Every letter from A to Z has its own unique pattern. For example, the letter H is represented by 4 dots, while I is represented by 2 dots. That means if you hear a particular pattern of beeps, it could be someone trying to say hi. Even the famous old Nokia SMS ringtone is based on a Morse code tune. Now, converting those sounds into actual words just by listening is a very challenging task. That's why a Morse code converter was also used. The ATC tower had a device that could listen to the Morse code beeps and automatically convert them into text. Nowadays, there are even many smartphone apps that can translate Morse code. Anyway, let's get back to our story. The Stardust aircraft was not fully pressurized. In other words, the cabin did not contain compressed air. The passengers were breathing air that was directly connected to the outside atmosphere. Whenever the aircraft climbed above 10,000 feet, the air became thinner, making it difficult for the passengers to breathe. To deal with this, the aircraft carried an emergency oxygen supply. Using all these facilities, the flight was expected to arrive in Santiago at around 5:45 p.m. But sadly, the aircraft never reached the airport. 1 hour passed, then another, and eventually night fell. Yet there was still no sign of the aircraft. By then, it had become clear that the plane had crashed somewhere. But where? No one had the answer. The very next day, search teams immediately set out to find the missing aircraft. Search planes and ground teams looked for it everywhere they could. But even after months had passed, no one could figure out where the aircraft had crashed. Meanwhile, the investigation had already begun. But since the wreckage had never been found, there was almost nothing the investigators could examine. After questioning ATC, it was discovered that the aircraft was supposed to land by 4:45 p.m. However, for some unknown reason, it never arrived. Just 5 minutes earlier, at around 5:40 p.m., the controllers had received a mysterious message. The controller explained that they had received an unknown Morse code transmission from Stardust, but they couldn't understand what it meant. The Morse code translated to Stendeck. According to the controller, the pilot was probably trying to send the word descent, but perhaps accidentally transmitted STENDEC instead. So the controller asked again. However, the pilot sent exactly the same Morse code a second time. Once again, the message translated to Stendeck, not descent. The strange thing was that Stendeck has no meaning at all in aviation. Now the investigators had to find out what the pilot had actually been trying to say in those final moments. Several theories were proposed. Some believed the pilot had intended to transmit descent. Others thought that perhaps the controller had not received the sound correctly. But according to the ATC controller, the signal was perfectly clear. There was no noise or interference, and the transmission was loud and easy to hear. That meant the chances of a reception error were almost zero. After all, a mistake might happen once, but repeating the exact same mistake again and again is highly unlikely. The controller's statement was accepted, and investigators began to consider another possibility. Perhaps the radio operator on board had made a mistake while sending the Morse code, or maybe he was no longer fully conscious and kept repeating the same error while drifting in and out of consciousness. Of course, it's easy to make theories like these, but every theory needs evidence. And no evidence could ever be found unless the aircraft's wreckage was discovered. From that day until today, no one has been able to explain the mystery of the word Stendeck. As for the wreckage, as the years passed, the search was eventually abandoned. The aircraft remained buried somewhere deep within the Andes Mountains for the next 50 years. During those 50 years, every investigator who had worked on the case eventually passed away. Whenever an aircraft crashes into a snow-covered mountain, the impact displaces a massive amount of snow. As a result, the upper layers of snow become unstable. Soon the snow begins to slide, and within minutes the entire aircraft can be completely buried beneath it. This is known as an avalanche. The same thing happened to Stardust. The aircraft was buried deep beneath the snow. As a result, no matter how hard anyone searched, without GPS data or the aircraft's exact location, finding it became almost impossible. That is why, even after years of searching, no trace of the aircraft could be found. Even today, in 2026, we still don't know exactly where the aircraft finally came to rest. Years passed, time changed, global warming increased, and it took nearly 50 years for the ice to melt enough to reveal the wreckage that had been hidden beneath it. The first discovery came in 1998, when two Argentine mountaineers found some metal fragments and an aircraft engine. Over the next few years, search teams returned to the site, but even then, they managed to recover only about 10% of the wreckage. In the year 2000, one of the aircraft's tires was found, and the surprising part was that the tire was still inflated after all those years. Investigators also recovered the remains of 5 people. DNA testing was carried out on the bones, and the remains were later handed over to their families. By then, the relatives of the passengers had also grown old. The memories of that tragic accident had slowly faded with time. As for the rest of the aircraft's wreckage, even today, no one knows where it is. This accident reminds us that until nature decides to reveal it, no one can find an aircraft's wreckage. The investigators understood this very well. They knew that the snow would melt little by little, and only then would the wreckage gradually appear, even if it took another 50 years. As for what caused the crash, there are several possible explanations. Investigators believe that the weather was bad that day. According to the flight plan, the aircraft was supposed to fly at an altitude of around 20,000 to 25,000 feet while passing alongside the Andes Mountains. Only after safely crossing the mountains was it supposed to descend, but it appears that the pilot began descending too early, perhaps because of the poor weather. As a result, an altitude of around 15,000 feet. Right after the crash, an avalanche was triggered. Within about 2 minutes, the entire aircraft was buried beneath the snow. And just like that, in only 2 minutes, almost every piece of evidence from the crash disappeared. The aircraft's radio operator transmitted a Morse code message that remains an unsolved mystery even today. Investigators believe that the radio operator was actually trying to say something else. Perhaps everyone on board was no longer fully conscious. Yes, you heard that right. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this aircraft did not have a pressurized cabin. That means once it climbed above 10,000 feet, the people on board would struggle to breathe normally. That's why emergency oxygen was provided for everyone on the aircraft. Now let's imagine that Stardust was cruising at 8,000 feet before reaching the Andes Mountains. Let's assume it would take around 30 minutes to cross the mountains. That means the aircraft would have to remain at an altitude of around 20,000 to 25,000 feet for those 30 minutes in order to clear the mountains safely. During that time, everyone on board would have been using their emergency oxygen masks. Now let's assume the emergency oxygen supply could last for 40 minutes. That gives them about 10 extra minutes of reserve. If everything went according to plan, the aircraft would safely cross the mountains and descend back to around 8,000 feet, where the passengers could breathe normally again without needing oxygen masks. But that day, the weather was bad. The pilots couldn't see clearly ahead. Perhaps because of the poor visibility, they couldn't tell whether they had already reached the mountains or whether they were still ahead. So they probably had to estimate their position and climb based on their judgment alone. Perhaps they climbed too early. In that situation, the aircraft should have descended before the emergency oxygen ran out. But because Stardust had already started using its emergency oxygen much earlier, it's possible that the oxygen supply was exhausted before the aircraft had completely crossed the mountain. Now, if the aircraft was still flying at 15,000 to 20,000 feet, breathing in such thin air would have been extremely difficult. The oxygen supply to the brain would begin to decrease. Hearing would gradually become weaker. Everything in front of their eyes would start to become blurred. When the pilot or the radio operator tried to send a Morse code message, perhaps they intended to transmit descent. But because they were no longer fully conscious, they kept transmitting Stendek again and again instead. Repeating the same mistake over and over is only likely if the person sending the message is no longer fully aware of what they're doing. The wreckage of the aircraft was found at an altitude of around 15,000 feet. From this, we can assume that the pilot had already begun descending earlier than planned. Perhaps the reasons were the bad weather, poor visibility, and the emergency oxygen running out. After looking at all the evidence and considering every possibility, this seems to be the most accurate theory to me. If the visibility had been good, the aircraft probably would never have hit the mountain. That's because this aircraft had a very unique design. The pilots had a clear forward view. There were also transparent observation panels that allowed them to see to the left and right. The aircraft even had specially designed viewing sections that made it easier to observe different parts of the aircraft. Whether they wanted to check the wings or the tail, they could see everything quite easily. They even had the ability to look below the aircraft, and they could also see behind it. In other words, they had almost a 360-degree field of view. The only limitation was human eyesight, so how could such a mistake happen? That is why investigators believe this was a case of controlled flight into terrain, CFIT. In simple terms, the aircraft had no major technical failure. Instead, the pilot unknowingly made a navigation error, and the aircraft flew directly into the mountainside. Even today, we still don't know where the remaining 90% of the wreckage is. Of course, we're curious to know, but perhaps some secrets are better left hidden beneath the snow, because those secrets will only be revealed when the ice begins to melt, when global warming continues to increase. We've already done enough damage to our planet, so perhaps it's better if some mysteries remain mysteries. This was today's video. Thanks for watching.